So to kick us off, let me go ahead and share my screen. You will notice that I'm not doing this in presentation mode because we definitely want to have an opportunity to show you how to leverage this meaty piece of content. As Christina mentioned, my name is Ellie Wu. I'm the VP here in the Sales and Customer Success Center of Excellence. And what that means for those who are not as familiar with our Center of Excellence is we're functionally aligned to be able to provide that deep advisory across our portfolio companies. And I get to focus on the sales and customer success side of things. When it comes to this report, I'm so excited that I get to be able to introduce this to you, but I also want to recognize and appreciate the critical contribution we've had across from Insight, everyone from analysts to managing directors, and of course, our amazing portfolio companies. And so when we think about my intro and the advisory I mentioned we do with our portfolio companies, today you'll get a glimpse into how we provide that data-backed guidance to improve post-sales org design, efficiency, and performance. All right, so jumping into things, you'll have access to the report after the webinar today, so that's super exciting. We can get into it and dig into it and have fun with that. When it comes to the what we're covering here, as I mentioned, we talk to so many of our portfolio companies to really understand what's the gap in the market, because there's no shortage of data out there. There are other reports. There are reports that see themselves as, they talk about benchmarks, and we really think about this as a report that answers the questions we hear every day in our advisory. And so the themes, this was also echoed in all of the questions that came in as part of the registration. So who is this report for? One of my favorite things about this is that it really is for everyone. So whether you're an executive thinking about your org design and wondering, is this really the best way to do it? There's answers in here for you. If you are an individual contributor and you want to share this with your team as a manager for them to be able to challenge how things might be done or look for opportunities, this is for them too. And so we want to encourage you to leverage this report, not just for yourself, but also across your teams. And with that, let's jump into the report. You'll notice here in the bottom left-hand corner, yes, that number is above 100. So why did we host this session? Because I wanted to have a chance to go through this with folks as I was sharing it with some of the preliminary access. Folks had access because they're part of the portfolio company. They were able to let us know, hey, this feels like a lot. So wanted to have a chance to introduce it to you in this way and do a walkthrough for everyone. So starting with the introduction. I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide because this is going to set the stage on how you leverage the rest of this report. And what I mean by that is, why is it that there's still so many questions about what does customer success do? Is it different than support? How is customer service different than customer success? What does account management do? The reason that there are so many of these questions is because when you look at the pre and post sales jobs to be done, there are so many different titles we're seeing that do this. And not every organization has every title. So it's important to orient yourself around this as you're working through the report to appreciate, okay, I see this company has X number of CSMs. They're the same ARR. Wow, they have so many more than I do. Think about this image because they may or may not have professional services. They may or may not have a dedicated implementation team. So that's the context that you want to bring with you as you work through this report. The next piece to appreciate are the attributes we looked at the data. Now, one of my most frustrating things when I was kind of in your seat leading teams was I would ask a question and the answer I would get is, well, it all depends. And so I get shown something, but then very quickly it would be qualified of how I can't really apply it to what I'm trying to do. We tried to address that by looking through it through different attributes. So whether you want to think about this by your company stage, triangulate that with your average ASP, look at it by your go-to-market strategy. This is why you see over 100 slides, right? Because we really wanted to be able to provide folks a way to think about this through their lens that really feels like it's applicable to them. Now, while that's awesome, you'll notice that there's a disclaimer here because, as I talked about the previous slides, there are still facets to consider that we weren't able to capture, otherwise it'd probably be 1,000 slides. So please take these as guideposts, as points of conversation. Don't plug them in to an Excel sheet for capacity modeling. That's going to be like the equivalent of WebMDing yourself. All right, so moving past the introduction, the next section. All right, so we've got this executive summary. And as I mentioned, folks will have access to this, so I'm not going to cover every slide. But what I will jump into here is we've provided almost think about it as like a sampler platter of all the data that's in here. The questions that were coming in, the hundreds of questions that were coming in as part of the registration, really fell into 3 themes. How do I build it? How do I measure it? Is it efficient? And so when we think about, if you want to have like a 5 to 10 minute overview of what this report can provide you, this is where you would go. So we've got the high level view of org design. So if somebody's asking, okay, where should customer support live? Well, interestingly enough, right, if I'm deciding between having it as its own department, going in operations, or the benefits of having it in customer success, this can then help lean into that. And then we're also seeing more CS teams report into the CEO. And given the current market conditions, I think it may definitely be one of the things that we see shifting a little bit more and more, given the focus that retention expansion is having in the current macro environment. So just clicking through the rest of these. You all can dig into that later, because as Christina mentioned, we now have 20 minutes left together in today's webinar. So jumping into the next piece. With so many of the Q&A, I thought what might be most helpful is to show folks how I might answer some of these questions with the data that we have available. And so a very popular question that came in was, what should my org design look like? Who should own expansion renewals? So jumping into that, you'll notice this post-sales org design is kind of a meatier part of the deck where we have 48 slides. So once you click that open, every section starts with an overview of the questions that we're looking to answer here. So this may be helpful to just start as, okay, does this answer something that I'm looking for? What area do I want to double click into here? And then we also show how to actually go through these slides. So for the example of today, if we're looking at, okay, I'm thinking about org design from expansion and renewals, I'll notice that the tab here is in the 4th or 5th one. So then I'll kind of jump down to where the 4th or 5th tab is. And yes, can appreciate that I've had a chance to get to know this report a bit intimately over the time of us working on it. So jumping into expansion, we start by level setting on how we're defining this. So we're looking at expansion purely through the cross-sell, upsell lens. And when we're looking at this, this is that high level view. This is equivalent to what you would see in the executive summary. Now, to dig into it, I talked about the attributes. All right, I think you're able to see this is where things get a little bit more intense, but it's okay. We're going to walk through it together. The attributes I was talking about earlier really orient around ARR, ASP, customer count, and sales motion. So some things you may notice here is if I have a sales motion that is product-led, I'm seeing folks really lean into account management and more than customer success, right? And so then you can have a conversation around that. Whereas, wow, with ASP expansion, heavily seeing that with sales. So being able to use this to orient, does it make sense if we don't even have a sales function really dedicated towards this, is now the time to consider that. That's how I would use this data to start informing some of the decisions you have going forward. Same thing for renewals. If you jump into the renewals piece, this is where you'll see the definition of how we look at it. And it's that motion. And then it may also be helpful for you to think through, okay, when we talk about renewals, what are the jobs to be done as part of that renewal, and unpack that even further as you're thinking about the roles and responsibilities within your organization. And when we're looking at renewals, we start seeing dedicated renewal specialists and managers when it comes to certain trends. So as an example, over 100 million ARR. That's where we're seeing that focus. And it could be that they are transactional, that it is very much a rubber stamp type of renewal, that the go-to-market motion or expansion motion isn't tied necessarily to renewals. And so that's why there's a dedicated renewal manager focused on this, which then allows either an account manager or a salesperson to then go focus on that growth and expansion. And I also saw that there were some questions about staffing and ratios. Without necessarily going too far in the weeds today, this is where the staffing and ratios are. We also have it by the same attributes: AR, ASP, customer account, sales motion. So you're able to triangulate and also still keep in mind that initial graphic I showed about, you may not have all of the roles that are reflected in the data that you see here. All right, next question is around efficiency. How do I know if I'm being effective and efficient? So jumping into the next section, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. We've got the post-sales efficiency segment. Again, you'll see the questions that are available through here. And one of the questions I hear a lot about is, how do we boost our efficiency? And so if you wanted to take a look at how you might consider boosting efficiency and why you want to boost it, is because not all NRR is created equal. And there's going to be more focus on what does it actually take from a resources, from an investment perspective to get to that NRR. And inherently, there's going to be some that are more efficient than others. For those of you who will be at Pulse next week, we actually will be doing a deeper dive on how do you improve your efficiency with this as one of the elements. So one way we're seeing companies boost efficiency is leveraging key partnerships. And so if that's something you're looking into, this could be a slide that's of interest for you to explore further. What kind of companies are leveraging partners? When are they leveraging partners, right? And to say, okay, well, if we're really kind of in that primary segment of SMB, maybe that's not a great fit for partners, right? Whereas, okay, our ARR is above 100 million. Are we hitting that point where it's becoming challenge or friction, causing friction in our growth motion, and leveraging partners can really help unstick some of that? The other question I've been hearing a lot is about outsourcing support. Is outsourcing support a great way to then gain efficiencies and drive more focus, or to do this at a lower cost? It's interesting to see that most of the companies that responded to the survey were not outsourcing support. And so when I kind of double clicked into why is that, it's because when you outsource support, there are considerations around what's the commitment to the outsource model? What is their onboarding and their learning curve? Is our product really a good fit for that type of model? Because I can see myself in that position where a poor support experience has actually been the impetus for me to look for another solution. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about the efficiency of your organization. And we've got a good chunk of data in here just around that. All right, let's take a look at another questions. What's the structure of the org, staffing of the org around roles and responsibilities? Who should own how much revenue? And do I have a dedicated renewals function? All right, well, that brings us back over to this section. And if I look at these slides here about how many accounts how much revenue do AMs and CSMs typically manage? Again, not for capacity modeling, really from a frame of reference, because there's also elements here of when they are managing these accounts, what's the actual effort required for each account? And how much does it vary between SMB, mid-market, enterprise, and strategic? Even doing a short 1 week, 1 month time tracking exercise with your team can really help refine your staffing model or even highlight opportunities for efficiency gains. And then this is the data that we have around the renewals function that's also in here. Again, jobs to be done, level of effort required for renewals feeds into this. All right, next question is, what are the best practices to scale and grow after an initial deal? Oh, I love this question. So when it comes to hard-won deals, here are the questions that are answered in this section, but let me double click into some of the data that we have around that. What do you do after that initial deal? How do you think about time to value? So jumping into here, when it comes to that initial deal, understanding like what does good look like? How are we compared to our peers? Looking at this through the attributes of ASP, sales motion, and whether you're on-prem versus cloud, that implementation conversation is going to be important to have. So when you're looking at the number of days based on ASP, it makes sense that lower ASPs have a faster time to implementation because they're usually a bit more straightforward, and you'll see more of the product-led elements in here. The next piece is based on sales motion. So it's quite interesting to see that the sales-led growth has the longest implementation days, but it's not surprising because those are usually, you know, the kind of engagements where there's more integration that's required, there's more complex selling that's required, more enablement. And so the longer implementation days, that makes sense. And when it comes to the hybrid and product-led growth, it could be that when you're able to have that self-assisted motion available, or that self-service, like a strong knowledge base, some good LMS, the learning management system to help guide customers through some of this, that combination of my product helping and also then having a guide to move them through can shorten that time, the time for implementation. And so when we think about the time to implementation, what's the counterpoint to that when we're thinking about measuring that time to value? I'll jump down now to slide 91. And the reason I want to tie those two together is the faster time to implementation, the faster you can get to your time to value. And to also consider, how are you actually measuring that value? Is it from your customer's point of view? And is it from a point of where you're seeing behavior change, right? Time to go live is a very popular one, but that's definitely something that you can consider internally to say, okay, does that really actually reflect the stickiness or getting over that hump with our customers so that they see the value? Because once you have access, doesn't always mean that you have value. You know, like there's plenty of folks who have a treadmill, you got to get on it. So we kind of move through the definition of time to value, how to think about it, and what's the average time to value we're seeing, and also further breaking that down by ASP and customer account. So you're seeing a lot around 90 days. If you are at 180 days, it might be worth a conversation to explore that further. All right, let's take a look at the next question. What was most surprising to you, if anything? So I'm actually going to take the opportunity to do a couple of things, because this is actually another area where folks ask a lot about on measurements. Who's being measured on what, right? When it comes to net revenue retention, so NRR, who's being measured on NRR and who isn't? So as I was looking at this, there's a couple of things that kind of stood out for me. When it was that down here, when it was the NRR, when the sales motion is product led, we have the account managers showing up at 57%. Now that makes sense, although I was surprised when it comes to that product-led growth that there wasn't a little bit more balance between customer success and account management. And with, you know, that's an area that I was like, oh, that's interesting, but certainly it could be that some of these, some of the companies have more account managers and customer success is still evolving. So when it comes to how they're positioning that, that's one thing. The other piece that I would love to see more of is where we're seeing sales-led growth, and NRR is, we're seeing the sales-led growth where NRR is being measured for customer success, but also would like to see that sales number go up. If it's sales-led growth, I was surprised to see that this being 29% and this being 12% being that much lower. Could also be how people think about that NRR number and an opportunity to have that conversation internally. Counterpoint, GRR, that retention piece. It was fantastic to see the sales-led growth and the consistency across all of the different segments and attributes where customer success is really chartered with that gross retention revenue. And as the customer count increases, you'll see that sales is less likely to be measured on that, because that's where you're looking at that partnership for those efficiency gains and to think about the design so that way you can have more focus, more mastery, and more efficiency. All right, so let me go ahead and close these back up. And that way you have a view across all of the different sections of this report. There's so much data in here, and encourage you to go through this. When it comes to this report, we've had a great deal of positive feedback from different folks. Gainsight, as some may know, is one of our portfolio companies. And so they were able to get early access to the report, and was fantastic to get this feedback from Nick, given that he's seen so many reports over the course of decades in the tech space, and certainly a good amount of time in post-sales and the work he's led here. And for those of you who will be at Pulse, I hope to see you on the 18th. That's when we're going to be having our investors' perspective on game changers for sustainable growth. We'll be double clicking into some more of the details here. It's going to be on the 18th at 10:45. You should be able to find it in the app if you are already logged in there. All right, so with that, let me take a peek over here at the Q&A to see if there's anything else that's open. All right, so I see here, what are leading indicators that an org can look at for longer sales cycles, 3 to 6 months? So when it comes to the longer sales cycles and the leading indicators, I would bring us back to that time to value, the data that we had around there, and being able to look into that and orient yourself around those pieces of data. So that's over here in the post-sales performance, time to value, about how long it takes, because especially if the sales cycle is longer, if you can accelerate this portion to get that down, then you'll be able to improve your chances of really solidifying that value before that next renewal, or shortening the sales cycle for that upsell, cross-sell. All right. How is the current climate impacting sales? Great question, Stuart. So as I alluded to previously, when we were looking at this summary, the executive summary on how we're seeing more folks come into more of the CS org reporting into the CEO, the reason this got me thinking about that is because the current climate is shifting the sales landscape in a way that you're seeing more executive, more key stakeholders, more economic buyers coming in earlier in the game, or even reevaluating what has already been bought. And that's then pivoting more folks to think about expansion and that renewal of like, okay, how do we keep what we have? Because now it's being looked at with a closer lens. And what are opportunities that we may be leaving on the table because we're not really optimizing our expansion motion? So when it comes to that, those are the two areas I would say it's impacting sales when it comes to selling through use cases, narratives, that value-driven conversation. That's where CS is well positioned to be able to lead. Do you have a definition of what the CSM role entails at different stages? Yes, that would be under the org design area. So if you want to think about your org design, you can think about it through the lens of coverage. Again, applying the nuances of what's the actual level of effort required for each of your CSMs when they are working with an account, and what other partners do they have internally. So if it is only your CSM and you don't have anybody that's kind of that technical account manager, or you don't really have a fully fledged support team yet, you're going to want to calibrate your CSM's roles and responsibilities that way. but being able to look at the focus. So when you're looking at the org design and what they may or may not be responsible for, this onboarding implementation could be a great slide to start with of, okay, are we at that point where we could benefit from focused onboarding and implementation? Let's take a look, right? Okay, if I'm at 30 to 100 million ARR, all right, it looks like a good chunk of folks have this sitting either in professional services or implementation onboarding. Well, what if my customer count is kind of in this 100 area? Then it's pretty evenly split between a specific team and customer success. All right, what's my sales motion? So kind of working through the thinking that way. Again, not necessarily saying this is the end all and be all, but having it guide the conversations. All right, and with that, they say time flies when you're having fun, and I always want to make sure that we respect everyone's time. So that brings us right up until the mark. Christina, is there anything else we want to make sure we close with? I saw a couple of questions here about what folks should expect next.
Thanks, Ellie. Yes. So by the end of the day, we will be sending an email to all of you with a link to Insight's blog, which will have this recording, as well as the full report for you all to explore and download. So keep a lookout for that. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We hope to see you at the next webinar.
Hope to see you at Pulse.